Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural San Diego ASLA Climate Action Committee webinar on Firescaping and the Miyawaki method of afforestation. My name is Stephanie Green, and I'm the chair of the Climate Action Committee. Before we dive in, I would want to acknowledge that this virtual gathering takes place on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay people. For millennia, the Kumeyaay lived in harmony with this very land. We at the San Diego ASLA, and especially the Climate Action Committee, draw inspiration from their wisdom as we strive to restore the health of these treasured lands through education and action. Now get ready because we have a fantastic speaker lined up. Joining us today is Dr. Trevor Maynard, a mechanical and fire protection engineer from Extropy Research. His impressive resume boasts a PhD in mechanical engineering from UC Riverside, professional licenses in both fire protection and mechanical engineering, and the esteemed NFPA Wildfire Mitigation Specialist certification. The journey to today's webinar was serendipitous. Trevor offered to make a presentation to our organization just as the Climate Action Committee was delving into the potential of the Miyawaki method. While initially exciting, further examination revealed potential incompatibility between the method's dense planting style and our regional fire safety requirements. This makes navigating the complexities of our fire restrictions a crucial first step in contemplating the use of the Miyawaki method in our region. Some housekeeping before I hand over the controls to Trevor. First, in the chat, we have posted a link to references that we talk about in our presentation. And second, please add your questions to the chat as we go, and they will be addressed at the end of both presentations. Now, to delve into the what and why of our fire regulations, I will hand things over to Trevor.
Thanks, Steph. Thank you very much, Steph, for working with me on this and allowing me to be here. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you. So just a little bit about my background. I've been in the fire industry for about the last 15 years. For 10 of those years, I was with the federal government in a couple of different agencies working on primarily wildfire, but also some structure fire aspects. And really my career kind of focuses on, and so I'm on the private side now, kind of just doing my own thing. Really what I'd focus on now are two things. So fundamentals of fire science, so kind of how fires ignite, how they grow, how they spread, and also how fire impacts the built environment. So we want to better understand how fire impacts people, structures, infrastructure, and hopefully move towards a place where we can more safely live among fire, because we know that problem is not going away. And before I get into this, I just want to say that my knowledge of landscape architecture is very unimpressive. So I will very frequently refer to vegetation as fuels, and I don't mean to trivialize anything about landscape design, landscape management, because there's a very important conversation to be had now of what's the interplay between fire protection and land use, and especially how landscapes have positive benefits for fire management and fire prevention. So hopefully you don't feel like I'm trivializing when I talk about fuels, but from the fire protection standpoint, we think of fuels as things that burn. So
can I pause real quick? Tracy, do you mind muting? I think we might be getting a little feedback.
So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on the regulatory aspects of two things. So identifying wildfire hazard and then mitigating the risks associated with that. And there's a very robust and continuously evolving regulatory framework that we have to work with. So hopefully in this presentation, I can shed some light on what the rules are, where they come from, and then we can talk about how landscape architects can help hopefully shape the future of some of these regulations. So San Diego, I think we all know that San Diego is a very high risk area for wildfire. Two of the incidents that stick out to me are the Cedar Fire back in 2003 and the Witch Fire in 2007. And if any of you were here at that time during these fires, you could testify to what an absolute disaster these were. So aside from the obvious human, a public health toll, there's a massive economic impact. The recovery of these fires, from these fires took years or even decades. And I think San Diego has been really fortunate in the last several years. We haven't had a major incident like this. A lot of that credit is due to our really outstanding fire suppression and fire prevention infrastructure. But if you look at the situation in Northern California the past 5 or 6 years, we know that fire is still an enormous problem, and it's only a matter of time before we have an event like these again here. So I want to briefly talk about fire science a little bit. So as a fire scientist, like kind of the things that we think about that make wildfires tick, there's really three principal components. The first is fuel. So in our case, it's vegetation. And we talk about the factors of fuel that we're interested in. It's the type, so the species of plant. We want to know how much there is, right? How much vegetation is there? How closely is it spaced? The condition of the fuel is also really important. So we all know that wet fuels are generally much harder to ignite and burn than dry, dead fuels. So that ties directly into another important factor, which is weather. So obviously, all the rain that we've had in the last few weeks, right now the fire risk is very low because those fuel moistures are so high. But as things dry out, it gets warmer, we're going to start to see that moisture be released from the fuels. And by the time you get to, early spring and then into summer, those fuels are pretty dry. And the longer you go without rain, the drier they get. The other big aspect of weather that we're concerned with is wind. So wind has kind of two major impacts. First one is as the wind blows over the vegetation canopy, it further just helps to draw out that moisture and dry the vegetation. The other aspect is wind obviously is a great mechanism for carrying embers. So as you have those burning embers, burning pieces of vegetation, wind can carry them sometimes for miles ahead of the main fire. And the last thing that we think about, and I think this is pretty intuitive for everybody, we know fire moves quite a bit faster uphill. And it's kind of just a simple physics problem of as a fire moves up a slope, kind of hugs the slope, and it just essentially heats up those fuels faster than if it were on flat ground. So all of the regulations, well, most of the regulations really pertain to protecting structures and trying to prevent structures from burning down. So we're not going to talk really about the land management aspects. We're going to focus on structure defense and regulations around that. And there's really three principal ways that structures can burn. So the most obvious one is direct flame contact. So if you have plants, trees right up against a house, obviously that's a concern because you have fire directly touching the structure. The second aspect we think about is radiant heat. So radiant energy, radiant heat is that heat that you feel like when you walk outside and you feel the sun or you stand next to a campfire, the closer you get, the hotter it is. That's just thermal energy that's transmitted through electromagnetic waves. And so if you have something like burning shed, like in this picture, or a burning tree right next to your house, that can actually produce enough radiant heat to ignite things on the outside or even inside of the structure. The last mechanism, which is really the most important and the most troubling, are embers. So embers are these pieces of burning material that come from vegetation, and they can transport long, long distances away from the main fire. And these are essentially millions of little vectors of fire that end up all over the place. And this video here on the left just gives you guys an idea of what those embers showers can look like during the fire. So these are obviously problematic, number one, because there's a lot of them. But number two, they're very small and they are burning, and the wind is pushing them into all these nooks and crannies. So things like ridge vents in your houses, attic vents, mulch beds. It's a huge problem because if you imagine, if you think of a typical suburban subdivision in Southern California, there's not a lot that will burn. So it's a lot of driveways, asphalt, nicely mowed, green, watered grass. But so when you think about that, right, the main fire has a tendency to kind of go around the neighborhood. The problem is the embers will land all over the place, and they can start these little smoldering fires, whether it's in an attic or whether it's in a mulch bed. And those can go undetected for hours and sometimes even days. And so you can imagine that occurring when a neighborhood is evacuated. There's not really anybody there to watch it. Fire department resources are pretty strained. So you get a situation like you see here on the right, where this is obviously a little bit dramatic because it's a long exposure photograph, but this firefighter is trying to knock out all these little ember ignitions. So those are kind of the basics of fire. I think most people are generally familiar with the risk, especially with embers, and that ties very closely back to vegetation because different types of vegetation can be more or less prevalent, or ember production can be more or less prevalent in different species. But moving to the regulation side, I'm not speaking on behalf of the agency, and I'm not a lawyer, so kind of like most of you, I'm just one of the people working to try to understand the regulations, try to help people comply with them, and hopefully figure out how we can help improve the regulations to improve fire safety and also to enhance land use. So when we talk about kind of where the regulations come from or why they exist, there's really two components. The first one is quantifying the hazard, which is essentially determining what's the probability that a given parcel of land is going to be exposed to wildfire. So that's the first step. And the second step is, okay, we know what the likelihood of exposure is. How do we mitigate the risk? So what are the things that we can do to lessen the risk for this specific parcel, understanding that we can't necessarily prevent fire from getting there, but we can do something about protecting the parcel or protecting the structure once the fire's there. So this first step, which is hazard quantification, if you look at this picture on the left, so this is Tecolote Canyon in San Diego City. And when we look at this, I think we kind of all inherently know that there's definitely fire risk here. So you can see lots of chaparral. We know that chaparral is a really good fuel, it burns really well. You can see a lot of dead component in there, dead and dry. And we can see the topography, right? There's some steep and rugged terrain. There's some houses at the top of the hill right there. And we know that this area is exposed to hot and dry conditions and high wind events. So we can look at this area or any area in the state and kind of mentally get an idea that there is some risk. What the challenge is with determining the overall fire hazard is how do we take this little micro, cosm of the state and expand it out to the entire state where we can actually map the hazard throughout large areas. And that's where this concept of the fire hazard severity zones come in. So this is a statewide effort that was initiated back in 1985 through legislation. And CAL FIRE, so through that legislation, CAL FIRE, which was formerly known as CDF, they were given the responsibility to actually map the wildfire hazard throughout the state. So CAL FIRE is the state authority for fire protection. So they're responsible for implementing statewide regulations for fire prevention, fire protection. And so through that legislative process, they were given this responsibility to map out the hazards throughout the state. So what they did was they got a lot of really talented people together and put together these science-based models that incorporate everything that we've talked about in terms of fire behavior, fire risk. And they came up with these scoring models that are, they look at relatively large areas. So we're talking, 20 to 200 acre blocks. So they're not looking at individual properties. They're looking at broader segments of land and just trying to categorize the hazard. Over the last 40 years, certainly the science has gotten better. The data collection has gotten better. There are more tools, more sensors, but in general, the philosophy has stayed the same. An important thing to think about is that these maps are showing you hazard, they're not showing risk. So they're very similar to flood maps, that a flood map will show you the likelihood that an area can be exposed to flooding, but it doesn't say anything about how a structure or infrastructure will respond to that. So the analogy here is, so this is a house somewhere on the Gulf Coast. So the hazard to this house is obviously the ocean. So you have hurricane, storm surge. So we know this is a vulnerable location for flooding. The risk in this photo is how does the house handle that hazard? So how does it respond to the hazard? So in this case, they put the house on stilts. So that's a risk mitigation. Is it perfect? Probably not, right? There's probably some scenario where these stilts could be damaged or fail, but their response to the hazard was this risk mitigation. And so when we talk about defensible space and vegetation management, that is our risk mitigation for the fire hazard. The important differentiation is the hazard exists irrespective of the risk. So whether or not there's a house there, the hazard is still there. So these hazard severity zones, there's three basic scoring categories, and these are differentiated just by the way the model scores the risk based on fuels, terrain, weather. It's important to differentiate between them because the regulations can change depending on what zone you're in. This is very important, and this is something that it leads to a lot of confusion. CAL FIRE's tried to, I think they've done a good job of explaining it, but it just gets a little bit wonky. So the original fire hazard severity zones, they were only mapping the state responsibility areas. So they were only required to map areas that the state has fire protection responsibility for. But if we think of like San Diego County, we know we have all these municipalities, we have different fire protection districts. In San Diego City, for example, the San Diego Fire Department is the one that's responsible for fire protection, not CAL FIRE. So for a long time, all of these local areas were just excluded from these fire hazard severity maps. So they were either making their own, or in most cases, they didn't have one. There was a very destructive fire in a local municipality in the Bay Area back in 1991, the Oakland Hills fire. And from that, there was legislation that required CAL FIRE to extend their hazard mapping responsibility to these local responsibility areas. They were only required to identify the very high fire hazard zones, not all three. So that's why when you look at the maps now, you can see San Diego City, there are these pockets of red. So it's all gray, which means this area is really not, they don't have moderate or high detection here. They're only detecting the very high fire hazard severity zones, so the highest hazard areas. However, in the last couple of years, there's been legislation that has now pushed CAL FIRE towards basically having to do that 3 hazard classification, so medium, high, or moderate, high, and very high for the entire state. So in the next few years, you'll see basically those 3 hazard areas being mapped throughout the entire state, whether it's state or local responsibility areas. So it's just really important when you look at these maps. So it can be confusing on CAL FIRE's website, because if you just Google fire hazard severity zones, you'll come to all these maps that they have. And some of them are PDFs, some of them are GIS maps. But you have to be careful, because some of those maps, if you look at the municipalities or local resource areas, they basically don't show anything. They just show a gray area, rather than this example where you can see the red in there. So use this link that I provided, and it's also in the document that Steph shared. This is a very nice kind of integrated GIS map that CAL FIRE has, a web map. That has all of the most updated maps, both for the state and all of the local resource areas. So stick with that. The other place to look is if you have a parcel of land that you're working with that's in a local municipality, local resource area, check with the LRA. So if you're in, for instance, city of Carlsbad or city of San Diego, go to their website and check. And their map data should agree with what's on the state maps. But it's a good idea just to check both. And really, if you're in San Diego City, they are the AHJ that's in charge. So you want to check with them first. So we talked about the hazard, and we talked about identifying hazards. The question now is, so how do we actually mitigate the risk? So how do we respond to that hazard? And this is where the concept of defensible space comes in. I think everybody's familiar and everyone's heard that term thrown around a lot. And defensible space it's mostly just deliberate vegetation management in accordance with fire protection principles. So it's thinning, vegetation thinning, vegetation management, in some cases removing vegetation. So the main concept of the defensible space is just creating that buffer of either non-combustible or less combustible materials between the house and the fire. There are also some other aspects of defensible space that are not related to vegetation, so things like fire department ingress and egress, but we're going to stick with the vegetation part of it. So there's 2 major goals of defensible space. The first is to minimize the pathways for fire to get to the structure. So if you look at this photo here on the left, this is a very nice 5 or 6 foot buffer of gravel around this wooden cabin. I'm not a huge fan of the pine needles, because those are great places for embers to land, but they've done a good job of getting combustibles away from the house. Although you do notice that there's some needle cast here, but mostly this is pea gravel or whatever kind of rock that is. And the other goal on the right here is to reduce the fuel continuity away from the structure. So if you think about how wildfires are fought, the main tactic of wildland firefighting is removing the fuel. So it's removing vegetation so that the fire doesn't have anything to burn. So in this picture here on the right, you're doing the same thing, you're just doing it before the fire gets there. So this is where it gets complicated. So fire hazard severity zones are pretty straightforward. You can look at the map and very quickly determine what zone you're in. When it comes to what the actual requirements are, even in an area that's relatively as small as San Diego County, the requirements are all over the map. And there's kind of this hierarchy of requirements. So it starts with the state. So the state CAL FIRE requirements are those basic minimum requirements for defensible space. The local municipalities, local fire protection districts often have more restrictive requirements that people have to comply with. And now what we're seeing more and more of is the insurance companies are adding requirements on top of that. So the state and local requirements are laws, so you legally have to comply with them. The insurance requirements are not laws, but if you want to have a policy with that insurer, they're starting to require more and more effort in the defensible space side. So we're not going to go through this whole table. It looks very complicated, but the reason I put this in here primarily is to share the links for when this gets sent out, and just to give you an idea of how regulations are all over the map. And I know we have a lot of people here, landscape architects. You guys are no strangers to working with codes and regulations, and fire protection is no different. So it's always this game of trying to figure out what code applies in what area for what specific thing I'm doing. But the main thing is for San Diego County, we have I think 10 or 11 different fire protection districts. We have areas that are state, we have areas that are federal land. So the requirements are really all over the map. So the best piece of advice I have, without going into specifics of which rule applies to what fire protection district or what part of the county, is just check with the AHJ first. And all of the fire protection districts and cities, incorporated cities in San Diego and the county are very good at putting the requirements online where they're relatively easy to find. So you don't have to do a ton of digging through codes. They've made some very good like homeowner consumer facing information pages to share exactly what the requirements are. And in general, these defensible space requirements are not super complicated. What most of them look like is something like this, which is kind of this zoned approach to vegetation management. So you get progressively fewer plants and combustible things allowed the closer you get to the house. And what's really coming into fashion now is this, what they call zone 0, this first 5 feet away from structures. It's looking like it's moving towards basically nothing combustible, including vegetation, is going to be allowed in those areas. And we'll talk about that in a minute, because that's probably the #1 topic of concern for people right now with defensible space. So the question is, so we know these are laws. When does the inspection actually happen, or do the inspections happen? So because it is a law, these fire protection districts, the AHJs in the state, they can do inspections wherever they want. And Southern California, they're pretty proactive with inspections. If you look at the percentage of properties inspected in Southern California, it's pretty high. So you could be subject to that. Some of you may have been, inspected on a property that you own or have worked with in the past. But another area that's important to remember now is for the last 3 years, anytime you sell real property in one of these fire hazard severity zones, it triggers a requirement for a defensible space inspection as part of the sale. So realtors should be familiar with this by now, but just something to remember if you're involved in a property sale. It does have to have that inspection, and the inspection does have to be done either by the AHJ, so by like the fire department, CAL FIRE, or a designated contractor through them. So I briefly mentioned the zone 0. So this is actually kind of one of the first things that Steph and I started talking about. And this was passed back in 2020. And so the framework for it is already in state law. However, the actual implementation details are still being sorted out. And so the final rules haven't been released. If you poke around on CAL FIRE's website, you can find meeting minutes where they've discussed it. And there's a lot of really thoughtful discussion about how this will work. But it's very likely that, or I wouldn't say it's very likely, it's very possible that essentially all combustibles in that 0 to 5 foot zone are going to be prohibited. And that's kind of the way that CAL FIRE has been broadcasting it, even though they acknowledge that the actual implementation hasn't been decided yet. It will apply to all of the state areas, as well as these very high fire hazard severity zones in local areas. But one thing to remember is, so it looks like now that the adoption of this statewide will probably be in the 2025, 2026 timeframe, where the actual rules are set. But an important thing to remember is that local municipalities, they can have more stringent rules. So San Diego County already has a 0 to 5 foot regulation. If you look in the county fire protection code, it is there. It's a little ambiguous in terms of what they mean by non-combustible materials. So one of the questions is, are there plants that we can consider either non-combustible or fire resistant? So that's going to be, I think, a big thing going forward is figuring out is, can we put any vegetation in this area? Like, is there anything that's safe? And there seems to be a lot of debate about whether or not that's going to happen. If you look at the list of people that supported this Zone 0 regulation, it is a broad mix of state and local government, firefighter associations, private industry, insurance companies. The reason I show this is that it's not going away if you look at the amount of support there is for this. So the question is, how can we work with these requirements and hopefully help make these requirements more useful for everyone? So we still have fire safety, but we can still have enhanced landscapes and improve our ecosystems. So kind of this last topic on fire resistant vegetation. So as a fire protection engineer and somebody who's not a botanist or involved in landscape management, from our standpoint, there's really no fire resistant organic material. Every organic material will burn under certain circumstances. I think we all know that some plants are more resistant than others to fire. The challenge is there's really no standard. So like for building materials, for roofing materials, we have a standard that says, okay, it has this amount of fire resistance. There's no standard like that for plants. So even though you can see like some fire protection districts, I think even San Diego County, they have these lists of fire resistant plants. There's really no standard. And so throughout most of the country and in the state, they've really kind of just disregarded that and said, well, we don't know how to tell what's a fire safe plant versus not. And so that's where I think the motivation is coming to just take everything out. So I think that will be one area that the landscape architecture community can help a lot with, is working towards research to help figure out, are there plants that are able to be placed in those zones that are really very low hazard. The mulch is another topic that's come up. From the fire protection standpoint, mulch is a concern because it's very good at fostering these smoldering fires. So embers can land in there and smolder for a very long time, and they kind of transport under and through the mulch, and they can eventually reach things that will burn more vigorously. So that is a concern, and that's why you've seen mulch removed from a lot of defensible space requirements. Mulch has kind of been banned close to structures. But again, that's the discussion of, does mulch do things that actually help from the fire prevention standpoint in the bigger picture? So in conclusion, in this brief introduction, I think the question that Steph asked me is, how can landscape architects get involved and get more active in the regulatory process? And I think the two things that really stick out to me are, number one, the fire resistant plant research and awareness. Because I'll tell you, as a fire protection engineer, I've never really seen much, in detail coming out about standards for fire resistant plants, or even research at looking at fire risk of different types of plants, other than some mulch studies, which Steph actually pointed me to a couple of them that were done recently. The second thing is, if you look through the recommendations and the regulations, landscape maintenance requirements and the whole thing around landscape maintenance, there's really not a lot written into the regulations about it. So we know that landscape maintenance is a huge part of fire safety, but it's really hardly mentioned in the requirements. And maybe that's intentional. Maybe they just are assuming that people won't maintain their landscapes. But I think that's another aspect that needs to be given a lot more thought. So with that, I'm going to stop my presentation and I'm going to turn it over. So if you just give me one moment. All right, I'm going to switch the host. Okay, Steph, you should be the host now. And you're muted.
All right, thank you. That was a great presentation. Thank you so much. And again, guys, we'll answer any questions you have and put them in the chat. So let me share my screen, find the window I want to share. All right. And All right, so we're going to start this part of the talk on the Miyawaki method of afforestation. I want to start off with a little semantics. How is afforestation different than reforestation? Afforestation refers to the establishment of a forest or stand of trees in an area where there were previously no trees or recent cover. It's essentially the process of creating a brand new forest. On the other hand, reforestation is the process of replanting trees in an area that was recently a forest but had been damaged or destroyed. In general, the Miyawaki method has been utilized as an afforestation practice. The promise of the Miyawaki method is to speed up the creation of very diverse and resilient climax forest ecosystems. It's promoted to be enhancing biodiversity. The multi-layered structure of the mature Miyawaki forest provides diverse habitats both below and above ground. To underscore the importance of this element globally, we have had a 69% decline in species populations since 1970. The National ASLA Climate Action Committee recently added biodiversity to its name to call attention to the seriousness of having hit a biodiversity tipping point. The Miyawaki method also is promoted as having very rapid growth. Miyawaki forests grow 10 times faster than a traditionally planted forest because it's designed to bypass most of the natural stages of plant community succession. It also is better at sequestering carbon with the density of biomass above and below the ground and focus on microbe networks. These forests efficiently capture and store carbon dioxide, contributing significantly to climate change mitigation. It's also promoted for its soil conservation. The dense vegetation also prevents soil erosion and promotes healthy soil development. It also conserves water very well. Miyawaki forests retain more water than traditional plantings, contributing to improved water security and resilience to droughts. And then resiliency in general. Indigenous plant species have spent thousands of years adapting to their local environment to create a supporting system. So using native plants supports our local biodiversity and makes our local plant and animal life more responsive to climate change. Now, again, I did title this one The Hype. So we will be going through, all these things as it adapts to Southern California. First, just a quick example of a traditionally prepared and planted Miyawaki forest. This is 2 years of growth on a 4,300 square foot Miyawaki forest planted at a public park in Cambridge. The 1,400 trees, which started as saplings, have already reached an average height of 17 feet. The Miyawaki method is the invention of plant ecologist Akira Miyawaki. With industry destruction and rebuilding pressure that came from World War II, Japan's forests had become dominantly non-native and single-layered. Miyawaki's concern was that Japan's non-native forests would be incapable of addressing climate change. He developed the Miyawaki method after decades of research and observation of plant communities in Japan, as well as in Germany. The first test of his method came at the Nippon steel plant in 1971. The plant had tried to create some forest embankments to deal with complaints, and the first plantings had been a failure. Today, the plant has over 2,000 acres of mature Miyawaki forest with trees that reach as high as 98 feet. With the success of this project, Miyawaki was asked to spearhead hundreds of projects across the country and then later in life internationally. In his lifetime, Akira Miyawaki installed 1,700 mini forests with an estimated 40 million trees. The Miyawaki method's journey didn't end with its initial success. In 2014, a TED Talk by an Indian engineer who had participated in planting a Miyawaki forest at his workplace catapulted the method onto the global stage. From bustling metropolises to remote villages, a global network of organizations has since sprung up, each one testifying to the method's transformative power and adaptability to diverse environments. I'll highlight just one organization, IVN, which is focused on school forests. They have planted 150 Miyawaki forests at school sites in and around the Netherlands. In 2023, California Assembly Bill 57 was introduced and unfortunately vetoed. The bill would have funded testing the applicability and effectiveness of the Miyawaki method to restore degraded lands and reforest urban areas in multiple regions throughout California. And today, the method is still expanding and gaining traction in California, with groups in LA and San Francisco taking the lead on implementation. Here are some figures that display the reach that the Miyawaki method has had to date. It's been implemented in 40 countries, on 2,400 projects on six continents, and estimated to have planted 48 million trees. A few of the use cases for Miyawaki forests are schoolyard forests, degraded and underutilized urban sites, nature patches and parks, industrial sites, rewilding waterways, and screens and buffers. So what are the core elements of the Miyawaki method? Note that there have been a number of revisions to the details of these elements as the method has been adapted to various global climates and ecosystems, including Southern California, which will be addressed later. The first element of the Miyawaki method is to determine the site's potential natural vegetation. Potential natural vegetation refers to the hypothetical vegetation community that would exist in a specific area if human influences and hazard events were entirely absent. It essentially paints a picture of the climate plant community that would naturally dominate a given location based solely on environmental factors like climate, geology, and other natural influences. Potential natural vegetation is a plant community that has optimal ecological resilience and the highest potential to enhance biodiversity at the specific site being restored, which is generally the native plant species that would naturally occur at the site. The second element is the multi-layered structure of the forest. The multi-layered structure replicates a climax forest plant community, fostering habitat complexity and supporting a wider range of species. The third element is site preparation and soil excavation. The goal of Miyawaki method's soil prep and amending is to mimic naturally occurring climate forest soil texture and quality. Soils are excavated to a depth of up to 3 feet, which requires heavy equipment. The fourth element is to amend the native soil based on the results of the soil testing, including biological testing, providing the right mix of microbes and amendments to enhance microbial life. The fifth element is dense planting and deep mulching. Unlike traditional plant spacing, Miyawaki forests involve planting at a high density. This replicates the regeneration process that occurs in a climax forest when a clearing in the canopy opens up due to a large tree failing. As the closely planted saplings have to compete for light, they shoot upwards instead of sideways. With this high density, they also interconnect their roots underground, sharing nutrients and communicating. To top it off, literally, heavy mulching 5 to 7 inches protects the soil, retains moisture, and nourishes plant life. The sixth element is maintenance and observation. Once established, which is anticipated around 2 years, Miyawaki forests require minimal maintenance. The dense vegetation and mulch suppresses weeds and conserves moisture, creating a self-sustaining ecosystem. At this last stage, the method encourages the community to become citizen scientists, documenting the life that is emerging and finding a home in the forest. The final cornerstone of the Miyawaki method is community engagement. Throughout the entire process, community involvement plays a vital role. This method naturally fosters intergenerational collaboration, since the plants are small enough to be handled even by young children. Moreover, due to the sheer volume of plants involved, the task requires a collective effort. Miyawaki emphasized in his writings the integral connection between humanity and nature, stressing that our well-being is intricately linked to the health of ecosystems and that it is our shared responsibility to nurture nature. This call to action has attracted diverse groups worldwide to adopt the Miyawaki method. The Miyawaki method is not without its critics. Overall, as the forest, so these are going to be overall and sort of local criticisms. As the forest matures, the initial planted biodiversity drops because understory plants die out as they are shaded out. And there's no scientific evidence that the mini forest method is better than other reforestation methods. We need scientific studies, especially regarding plant density. It requires expertise in site preparation and plant selection. It has a high cost in the initial establishment for soil excavation, amendment, and dense planting. And the approach needs better recognition of ecological differences due to climate or other factors. And some of the local criticism is it's not adapted to our region and plant communities. There's too many plants that are competing for too little water and nutrients. And adoption without methodical testing could cause failures and discourage the public's interest in supporting restoration efforts. I mean, to some of this, I put on the side that Miyawaki is different from other forest planting techniques and that it aims to simulate the conditions of mature climax forest in the soil condition and planting composition and density. The Miyawaki forest aims to mimic a patch of ancient forest floor suddenly open to the sky. Now, one thing you'll need to look into, or anybody interested in Miyawaki, is what are San Diego's native forest communities? So back to the core element of Miyawaki forest is emulating a densely vegetated and multi-layered forest ecosystem. While lacking dense canopies like forests in temperate climates, our native forest communities serve similar ecological roles. And then, You can see I have southern oak woodland, riparian forest, Torrey pines forest, southern interior cypress forest. We have all these. Why did I have chaparral on here? Well, chaparral is our dominant wildland, thriving in harsh conditions. It is usually a successional plant community that gradually moves to oak and pine forest if the soil depth supports it. The Miyawaki method can be used to create standalone chaparral elfin forests, or chaparral species can support the development towards other climate forest ecosystems, or that's climax forest ecosystems. Sorry. And here's an example of the Miyawaki method being used locally in Los Angeles. So Catherine Pacraduni with LA Microforce has tested the Miyawaki method at several test locations in LA. The current methodology being utilized by Catherine is posted on the LA Microforce website with a very helpful how-to guide, including plant selection, a plant selection customizer, and which also calculates quantities. As her first Miyawaki style forest in Griffiths Park is nearing 3 years old, she's continuously honing the modifications to the Miyawaki method based on development of these forest projects. Catherine's recommended modifications were made in response to our region's drier, shrub-dominated ecosystems with lower tree diversity and reliance on sunlight for seed production. Catherine also used her expertise on natural plant communities, succession patterns, and vegetation patterns to determine optimal tree-to-shrub ratios. Some of the things you can see on here, one of the big things is, reduced density, a variation in some of the forest layers, especially perennials, and then the layers are very heavily leaning towards perennials versus the Miyawaki method. The Miyawaki is in the gray, and the LA Microforce method is in the yellow. And another big thing is there is no tilling, and so there's no of the very extreme soil mending that the Miyawaki does. So there's definitely a lot of differences, which we can go into detail later. Here's the difference in the tree canopies and the layering. And then this is a project that she's working on, Catherine Pacarduni with LA Microforce is currently working on in Los Angeles at Ascot Hills Park. It's going to be LA's biggest microforest at 11,000 square feet. And actually, they just planted it just recently, and there's going to be some more volunteers days for maintenance. So I will be talking about that later too. So one of the key elements of the Miyawaki method is to plant into soil that closely resembles the soil of a climax forest. I'm going to say that over and over again because I think that's definitely one of the things that differentiates it. Miyawaki does this by deeply excavating, tilling, and heavily amending the soil. However, this harms the soil structure, creates stratified soil layers, which will always repel each other, and that roots won't cross. This also makes a perched water table where the amended soil and unamended native subsoil meet, for which drainage and subgrade should be considered. For severely compacted sites, though this might be a technique to try, constructed soil sections have been successfully used in our region to grow healthy trees to maturity, such as with suspended pavement systems. Another way to achieve climax forest soil is to grow it. This adds 1 to 2 years of time and additional maintenance, but it reduces overall cost and labor. It doesn't have the same issues with stratifying layers, but it might not be enough for severely compacted and degraded sites. Another common issue brought up about the Miyawaki method is that the recommended plant density has not been studied to determine if it's truly optimal. There is significant cost involved in the number of plants and questions about the health of the plants long term. Also, with the low annual precipitation in our region, can the plant's demand for water be met? More controversially, should this method be limited to only planting native forest communities? Our region's tree health is dependent on climate. Years of summer temperatures have accelerated the change in, native ranges have, changed as climate changes. Should this process be tested with native neighbor plant communities or very urbanized locations, or in very urbanized locations with climate-ready species? And this graph is showing the decline in our forests in Southern California in general. And then last, are there other methods to consider that would complement the Miyawaki method, such as landforming to plant the rain to provide forests with the reliable water supply, as you see here in the hugelkultur technique developed by Studio Petrichor in LA? I put together just a quick planning checklist for mini forest, and this is the reason why we have the collaboration today on our call, is that we need to identify an appropriate site. And the first thing is the fire hazard severity zone and the brush management requirements, defensible space requirements, insurance requirements. Got to make sure with the dense planting, even with Catherine Pacraduni's method, it's still very densely planted and would not be allowed in most brush management zones. So that needs to be looked at first and identified. And then you have permission from the landowner. The size, it kind of goes back and forth, but I kind of landed on a 14-foot dimension as a minimum dimension. But so that's still quite small. You could do, 196 square foot size mini forest. You need access to water supply, and it needs to be free of conflicts. And you want to pick a site, if you're putting a forest that you want to grow for decades, you want to make sure it has longevity. We need to make sure that it has access for stewards to provide maintenance. And then you go into the soil observation, which hasn't really, this site observation, which hasn't really changed from the Miyawaki method, anything here. And then determine your forest methodology. And this is kind of from the last slide, the soil prep. Are you going to do the extensive prep per the Miyawaki method, or surface treated, and how long? Your plant palette, are you going to mimic the native intact plant communities or experiment with nearly native or climate ready species? And then planting density, ... That's one thing that I'm not sure about, and it needs to be tested. And then installation timing, it's easier to establish in the cooler, wetter months. Plant roots grow year round, and improper irrigation, and then also improper irrigation in the hotter months could expose natives to root rot pathogens. Oh, there's a small one. Not too small, but. So in researching for this presentation, I've come to the conclusion that the most important thing about the Miyawaki method is that it is a concept that has made the general public throughout the world interested in learning about creating and nurturing biodiverse ecosystems. It is a concept that is accessible to their means and captures their imaginations. We must protect this passion and learn if and how this method works in our region. And this is some of the start that we can do. Again, this is the microforest, the largest one in LA. They're going to be having a microforest maintenance day, February 24th. We can start there, but we're also, we are looking to create one here, and we need a site. So if you know, please try to connect us with a good place. We did have something, but we did have a conflict with fire zone. So we're looking. And then here's some resources, which all of these have been put in the chat. And now for questions. I will open it up. Did we have any in the?
I don't see any questions in the chat.
Okay, none in the chat. Well, I'm opening it up if anybody wants to chime in with a question or two.
Stephanie, this is Jackie.
Hey, Jackie.
First of all, awesome presentation. Really, really interesting. And the thing that is resonating with me is like the soil structures that you talked about. Having done a fair bit of restoration in my time, there's a lot of controversy about, like you said, of disturbing the soil structure or leaving it the way it is. And then of course, just using kind of like inoculations of mycorrhizae, since our soil is quite different than a lot of soils on the East Coast or even north of us. And that's a challenge for me. I'm like, I see the benefits of some of the amendments that could possibly help in this method. But as you're familiar with our soils here, it's really different. So to me, that might be one of the most striking alterations we would have in this method if we're applying it locally.
And I think that's the thing, is that I don't think it has to be broadly applied the same way at every site, the method itself. That's kind of where the conclusion I got to. If we have an insanely compacted urban site in the middle of, concrete jungle, it might be okay to dig down 3 feet and totally replace that soil to create some biodiversity patch, within the city, if that's gonna, because we have seen that effective with suspended pavement systems, not specifically the Miyawaki style of amending it, but with, providing that structure to that soil, so there's soil volume for trees to grow. So anyway, yeah, I think my main thing is it has to be tested, and I'm concerned that people just start doing it and then they have failures, especially if they, aren't thinking, specifically for our climate. I think Catherine Pacarduni's work up in LA is a great start for anybody who wants to start there. That's definitely sound ecological work. I think my only thing is, and it's probably, I'm sure she would love to do it, is just to grow soil before you ever plant would be kind of the main thing. That would be fantastic. I haven't seen that that's been like part of the process, to really just grow the soil first and then plant. Because I think, again, one of the key things is that the Miyawaki method is they're planting into that climax forest soil. Like, it's supposed to be basically as if, you had a tree failure in a climax forest and the canopy just went away, and now it's the, what's below and all the seedlings and the seed bank that's there competing and growing up in that, now that that open patch.
Yeah, like you said, so if you're trying to emulate a climax forest, where do you find the example soil to pull from to try to mimic that soil in the chosen disturbed site, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially here on the coast with all the development on the coast, because obviously our soils here would be different than like the foothill forest, right?
Mm-hmm.
So where that starting point, I guess, is like what types of soils are you trying to create to like start from? So how would you, yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's also, we're just going back 500 years to colonization. What was here before that? There was a lot of, a lot of deforestation that happened at that point, and agriculture, and trees couldn't regenerate. So, you could go further back in history, or you could go forward to where we have climate change and we need to help plants move a little bit, test out some plants moving around a little, too. So there's lots of methods, the way this could go. And I think that it's a method that's thought that it can be on a very small scale, I think is interesting, to be able to do a lot of different types of tests in different locations. So.
Hey, Stephanie, this is Phil.
Hey.
Hey, great presentation to you both. A really good reminder on wildland urban interface and fireproofing. And I don't think, there's I think always there's a place for the Miyawaki forest in our landscapes. But I kind of would tend to agree. We face a lot of challenges trying to get over the hurdle from the agency standpoint on projects and installations in high severe fire zones. So kind of looking towards maybe more of the urban landscapes for these test gardens. And I guess I don't want to say, lose sight of the forest through the trees, or vice versa. Is that, the way I've understood the Miyawaki method was that it's just the site's potential to rewild, and what plants would be good progenitors and candidates to rewild that. So really working with the site's existing soils, and not trying to create an artificial environment like we often do in the ornamental side. But I'm really impressed. I'm my walk away, a good kernel that Catherine up in LA is is doing so much testing and data collection on what are the right aspects to translate this type of technique to Southern California. So I'm really glad about that. And you know, I think collectively maybe we need to look at what, you know, in our both our professionals and personal paths as what would be appropriate sites to start this process here in San Diego County. So, but again, you know, I think the aspect of that is that on planting day, you know, the preparation and planning behind that, but on planting day, it really to try to involve the community so you can try and leverage disadvantaged and underserved communities in this process as well. So my thoughts, but great presentation today.
Thank you. You know, those are all great points, and the community aspect can't be underlined enough. I mean, it's really the most beautiful thing about this method is how much it has inspired people to want to look into bringing biodiversity back into their natural environments. And so, you know, I think that's why from a, you know, why should landscape architects get involved? Well, you know, people are really interested in doing this, and does it work here? And, you know, how, you know, is there something from this that, you know, really can help produce, you know, these forests that produce, you know, grow faster, that, you know, have all the benefits that were discussed. You know, can we really do this here and involve the community and get them interested in biodiversity locally? And it is 1 o'clock. If so, but I'm willing to stay on if anybody has any further questions. So hearing none, I'm going to stop the video. Oh, not that video. Wait, how do I do the recording? I'm sorry, everybody. This is terrible. Can't find it. Pause, stop.
It stops when you finish when you sign off.
Oh, okay.